The concert hall was silent now. Just an hour ago it had been alive with the sound of violins, cellos, and trumpets blending together in perfect harmony. The audience had given a standing ovation, the musicians had taken their bows, and now everyone was gone. Everyone except David. David pushed his cleaning cart across the polished wooden floor, the wheels making a soft squeaking sound that echoed through the empty hall. He had been doing this job for 12 years now. 12 long years of mopping floors, emptying trash bins, and wiping down the brass railings that lined the aisles. Most people wouldn't even notice him during the day. He was just part of the background, invisible in his gray uniform with the building's logo stitched on the pocket. But David didn't mind being invisible. In fact, he preferred it, because being invisible meant he could do what he loved most without anyone asking questions or making comments. He could listen to the music. Every night, after the orchestra finished their performance and the audience filed out through the grand lobby, David would take his time cleaning. He'd start with the upper balcony seats, then work his way down to the main floor and finally to the stage itself. The whole process usually took about 3 hours, but David often stretched it to 4 or 5. His supervisor had stopped questioning it years ago. The place was spotless under David's care, so why complain? Tonight was like any other Tuesday evening. David had watched the performance from the back of the hall while pretending to check the exit signs. The orchestra had played Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and it had been magnificent. The conductor, a stern-looking man with silver hair and an expensive suit, had led the musicians with dramatic sweeps of his arms. David had memorized every movement, every gesture, every moment when the conductor's baton sliced through the air to bring in the brass section or soften the strings. Now, alone in the empty hall, David stood on the stage with his mop handle held like a conductor's baton. His eyes were closed, and in his mind the orchestra was still there. He could hear every instrument, every note. His hand moved through the air, keeping time with the music that only he could hear. Left, right, up, down, building to the crescendo, then pulling back for the gentle passage. This was his secret performance, the one nobody ever saw. What the other custodians didn't know, what the musicians didn't know, what nobody in this entire building knew, was that David hadn't always been a janitor. There was a time, many years ago, when he had been on the other side of that stage. A time when he had held a violin instead of a mop, when he had worn a tuxedo instead of a gray uniform, when his name had been printed in concert programs instead of being listed on the cleaning schedule. David had been good. Really good. His teachers at the music conservatory had called him gifted. One professor had even said he had the potential to become one of the great violinists of his generation. He'd won competitions, performed in small concert halls, and earned a full scholarship to study at one of the country's most prestigious music schools. The future had seemed bright, full of possibility and promise. But life has a way of changing plans. David's father had gotten sick during his second year at the conservatory. Cancer, the aggressive kind that requires expensive treatments and round-the-clock care. His mother worked 2 jobs, but it wasn't enough. The medical bills piled up like snow in winter, higher and higher until they threatened to bury the whole family. David had made the only choice he could make. He'd left school, sold his expensive violin, and found work. Any work. First at a grocery store, then at a factory, and finally here at the Metropolitan Symphony Orchestra as a custodial worker. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd gone from studying music to cleaning up after those who performed it. That had been 12 years ago. His father had passed away despite all the treatments. His mother had eventually recovered from the financial devastation, but by then, David's window of opportunity had closed. The music world moves fast. Scholarships don't wait. Career paths don't pause for personal tragedies. His former classmates had graduated, won positions with orchestras, or become teachers themselves. David had become invisible. He'd thought about trying to go back, of course, but starting over in your 30s when you'd already fallen so far behind seemed impossible, so he'd convinced himself that being near the music was enough, that cleaning these halls, touching the same stage where great artists performed, listening to rehearsals during his afternoon shift was a decent substitute for the life he'd lost. Most days, he believed it. Most days, the ache in his chest was manageable. But some nights, like tonight, when he stood alone on that stage conducting an invisible orchestra, the pain was sharp and fresh as if no time had passed at all. David opened his eyes and looked out at the empty red velvet seats. 2,000 of them, arranged in neat rows that climbed up toward the crystal chandeliers hanging from the ornate ceiling. He'd sat in one of those seats once, years ago, as a young student watching a master violinist perform. He'd dreamed of being up on this stage, of having an audience lean forward in anticipation of his next note. He shook his head and picked up his mop. Dreams were for people who could afford them.
He had bills to pay, an apartment to maintain, and a job that, if nothing else, was stable and reliable.
The symphony orchestra wasn't going anywhere, which meant David wasn't either. He began mopping the stage, working in steady, methodical strokes. The wood gleamed under the stage lights, reflecting his distorted image back at him, an older man now with lines around his eyes and gray starting to show in his dark hair. Not the young, ambitious musician he'd once been, but his hands were still steady. His fingers still remembered the positions on the violin's neck, even though it had been years since he'd held one. Sometimes during his lunch break, he'd sit in the storage room where the orchestra kept their extra instruments. He'd never dared to take one out and play it. That would be crossing a line, violating the trust his employers had placed in him. But he'd look at them, especially the violins in their cases, and his fingers would twitch with muscle memory. The cleaning cart's wheels squeaked again as David pushed it toward the wings of the stage. He had the upper offices to clean next, then the practice rooms in the basement, and finally the lobby with its marble floors and grand staircase. Another night, another shift, another day of being invisible. He didn't know it yet, but his invisible days were about to come to an end. Sometimes fate waits patiently in the wings, ready to walk on stage at exactly the right moment. And for David, that moment was just a few days away. For now, though, he was just a custodial worker in an empty concert hall, pushing his cart and dreaming of music that only he could hear. It happened on a Thursday evening, exactly 3 days after that quiet Tuesday night. David was following his usual routine, starting with the balcony seats and working his way down. The orchestra had just finished their rehearsal for the upcoming weekend performance. Most of the musicians had already left, their instrument cases in hand, chatting about dinner plans and weekend schedules as they headed out into the cool evening air. David had learned all their names over the years, though none of them had ever learned his. There was Patricia, the first-chair violinist who always arrived early and left late. Thomas, the cellist who told bad jokes during breaks. And then there was the new conductor, Maestro Wilhelm Hoffmann. Hoffmann had joined the orchestra 6 months ago, replacing the previous conductor who had retired after 20 years. Where the old conductor had been warm and encouraging, Hoffmann was cold and demanding. He was a tall man with sharp features and an even sharper tongue. The musicians complained about him in hushed voices during their breaks, but nobody dared challenge him directly. He'd conducted major orchestras in Europe and had a reputation that preceded him like a storm cloud. David had watched Hoffmann during rehearsals, and he had to admit the man knew music. Every correction Hoffmann made was precise and correct. Every criticism, though delivered harshly, improved the performance. But there was an arrogance to him that David found difficult to stomach. Hoffmann treated the musicians like instruments rather than people, and he treated everyone else like they were beneath his notice entirely. The rehearsal had ended badly tonight. Hoffmann had been frustrated with the second violin section, stopping them over and over again on the same passage. Finally, he'd thrown down his baton and stormed off the stage, announcing that if they couldn't get it right by tomorrow, he'd find musicians who could. The threat hung in the air like smoke as the orchestra members quietly packed up their instruments and left. David had waited an extra 30 minutes after the last musician departed before beginning his cleaning routine. He wanted to make sure everyone was gone before he allowed himself his nightly ritual. The concert hall was his sanctuary during these late hours, and he protected that solitude carefully. He was on the stage now, mop handle in hand, eyes closed as he conducted an invisible orchestra through Tchaikovsky's violin concerto. His movements were fluid and precise, his free hand shaping the phrases in the air. In his mind, he could hear every note, every swell of the strings, every delicate passage of the woodwinds. This was the piece he'd been working on when he'd had to leave the conservatory. He'd never gotten to perform it in public. "Playing pretend, are we?" The voice cut through David's concentration like a knife. His eyes snapped open and his heart jumped into his throat. Standing at the back of the hall halfway up the center aisle was Maestro Hoffmann. The conductor had his overcoat draped over one arm and a leather folder in his hand. He must have forgotten something and come back for it. David's face went hot with embarrassment. He quickly lowered the mop handle, his hand trembling slightly. "I'm sorry, sir. I was cleaning. I didn't realize anyone was still here." Hoffman walked down the aisle toward the stage, his footsteps echoing in the empty hall. There was an amused smile on his face, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who discovered something entertaining at another person's expense. No, please don't stop on my account," Hoffman said, his accent making his words sound even more condescending. "I was quite enjoying the show. Tell me, do you often pretend to conduct when you think nobody's watching?" David wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. I'm sorry. It won't happen again." "You know what piece that was supposed to be?" Hoffman asked, climbing the steps to the stage. He was close enough now that David could see the glint of mockery in his eyes. "With all that arm-waving you were doing?" I wasn't, David couldn't find the words. His throat felt tight. "Let me guess," Hoffman continued, clearly enjoying himself. "You listen to us rehearse every day and you think that makes you understand music. You think that because you push your little cleaning cart around this stage, you somehow absorb the knowledge and skill it takes to become a real musician." "No, sir, I don't think that at all," David said quietly, looking down at the floor. "Good. Because you're just a custodial worker." Hoffman said the words slowly, emphasizing each one. "You clean floors. You empty trash cans. That's what you do. Leave the music to those of us who actually understand it, to those of us who have dedicated our entire lives to mastering this art form." David nodded, his jaw clenched tight. He wanted to tell Hoffman that he had dedicated his life to music too, that he'd once been good enough to earn a scholarship to one of the best conservatories in the country. But what would be the point? That life was gone. This was who he was now, just a custodial worker. "I apologize for the disturbance, Maestro," David managed to say. "It won't happen again." Hoffman laughed, a short, sharp sound that bounced off the walls. "I should hope not. Imagine if the board members saw you up here, pretending to be something you're not. They'd think we're running a circus instead of a respected symphony orchestra." He walked past David to the conductor's podium where his folder lay forgotten. He picked it up, tucked it under his arm, and turned back toward David with that same mocking smile. "You know what the difference is between you and me?" Hoffman asked. "Between you and any of the musicians in this orchestra?" David didn't answer. He just stood there holding his mop handle, feeling smaller and smaller with each passing second. "Talent," Hoffman said. "Real, genuine, God-given talent. Combined with years of training, sacrifice, and dedication. You can wave your arms around all you want in this empty hall, but it doesn't change what you are. A janitor with delusions of grandeur." With that, Hoffman walked off the stage and back up the aisle toward the exit. David heard his footsteps recede, heard the heavy door open and close, and then he was alone again. But the silence felt different now. It felt heavy and suffocating instead of peaceful. David looked down at the mop handle in his hand. He suddenly felt foolish and angry and sad all at once. Who was he kidding? Hoffman was right. He was just a custodial worker. Whatever skills he'd once had were gone now, rusted away from years of disuse. He had no right to stand on this stage, pretending to be something he wasn't. He finished his cleaning quickly that night without any of his usual lingering. He didn't conduct invisible orchestras or close his eyes to hear phantom melodies. He just cleaned, loaded his cart, and went home to his small apartment where he microwaved a frozen dinner and went to bed early. But sleep didn't come easily. He lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, Hoffman's words playing over and over in his mind. "You're just a custodial worker." The words hurt because part of David believed they were true. But another part of him, a part he'd tried to bury for 12 long years, whispered something different. That part whispered that Hoffman was wrong. That talent doesn't just disappear. That some things once learned live in your bones and blood forever, waiting for a chance to come alive again. David rolled over and closed his eyes, but that whisper stayed with him through the night. Growing louder with each passing hour, David couldn't stop thinking about that night. 3 days had passed since his encounter with Hoffman, and the conductor's words still echoed in his head every time he stepped into the concert hall. "You're just a custodial worker." The phrase had burrowed under his skin like a splinter he couldn't remove. He'd stopped his nightly ritual of conducting invisible orchestras. Now he just cleaned quickly and efficiently, keeping his head down and his thoughts to himself. When Hoffman was in the building, David made sure to stay out of sight. He'd rearrange his schedule, taking his breaks when the rehearsals were in full swing, returning only when he was sure the conductor had left for the evening. But something was changing inside him. The humiliation had sparked something unexpected. Instead of crushing his spirit completely, Hoffman's mockery had lit a small fire in David's chest. It burned quietly at first, just an ember of anger and stubborn pride. But with each passing day it grew warmer and brighter. On Saturday morning, his day off, David found himself standing in front of a storage unit on the outskirts of town. He'd been paying $40 a month for this 10 by 10 space for the past 12 years, though he rarely visited. Inside were boxes of his old life, books from the conservatory, concert programs with his name printed in them, photographs of recitals and competitions, and somewhere in the back, wrapped in an old blanket, was his violin, not the expensive one he'd sold to pay his father's medical bills. That instrument had been worth more than a new car. But before that violin, there had been another one, his first serious instrument purchased when he was 16 with money saved from 3 summers of working at a restaurant. It wasn't a masterpiece, but it was a good violin made by a skilled craftsman. He'd kept it all these years, unable to let go of it even when letting go seemed like the only way to move forward. David unlocked the unit and pulled up the rolling door. The musty smell of cardboard and old memories hit him immediately. He stepped inside, navigating around the boxes until he found the one he was looking for. It was in the far corner, right where he'd left it more than a decade ago. His hands shook as he unwrapped the blanket. The violin case was covered in dust and the leather handle had cracked with age. He unlatched it and opened the lid. There it was. The wood had dulled slightly, but the instrument was still intact. The strings were old and would need replacing, but the body was sound. He lifted it carefully, feeling the familiar weight in his hands. It felt strange and right at the same time, like greeting an old friend after years of separation. He tucked it under his chin, and even without the bow, the position felt natural. His left hand found its place on the neck, his fingers falling into formation over the strings. Could he still do this? After 12 years of pushing mops and emptying trash cans, did his hands still remember? David closed the storage unit and drove home with the violin case on the passenger seat. He lived in a small 1-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building. The walls were thin, and he could usually hear his neighbors' televisions and conversations. He worried about disturbing them, but it was the middle of the day. If he was going to do this, now was the time. He set up in his living room, clearing space near the window. The bow needed rosin badly. Fortunately, he'd kept a small block of it in the case. He worked the rosin up and down the bow hair, watching the white powder accumulate. Then he tightened the bow to the proper tension, his fingers remembering the exact feel even after all these years. The violin needed tuning. He plucked each string, listening carefully, adjusting the pegs. He didn't have a tuner anymore, but his ear was still good. He worked slowly, bringing each string into tune with the others. A, D, G, E. The notes rang out clear in his quiet apartment. Then came the moment of truth. David raised the violin to his chin, positioned the bow over the strings, and drew it across in a long, slow stroke. The sound that came out was rough and scratchy. His bow arm was stiff, the angle wasn't quite right, and his vibrato was non-existent. It sounded terrible, but he didn't stop. He played a simple scale, C major up and down. It was something a beginner would practice, but his fingers fumbled even with that. The muscle memory was there, buried deep, but the execution was rusty and uncertain. His fingertips hurt almost immediately. He'd lost his calluses years ago, and the metal strings bit into soft skin. David spent the next hour just working on scales and basic exercises. Things he used to do as warm-ups, things he could once play in his sleep, now required intense concentration. His shoulder ached. His fingers cramped. Sweat beaded on his forehead from the effort of doing something that used to be as natural as breathing. But slowly, very slowly, things started to come back. His bow arm loosened up. His fingers began to remember their positions. The notes started to sound cleaner, more confident. It was like watching someone wake up from a very long sleep, groggy and uncertain at first, but gradually becoming more alert and aware. By the time the sun began to set, David's fingertips were red and sore. His shoulder was screaming, and his neck was stiff from the unfamiliar position. But he was smiling, actually smiling for the first time in days, because even though he sounded rough and unpracticed, even though he had a mountain of work ahead of him to regain even a fraction of his former skill, one thing was absolutely clear. He could still play. The talent hadn't died. It had just been sleeping. Over the next week, David fell into a new routine. He'd wake up early before his shift and practice for an hour. Then he'd go to work at the symphony hall, clean during his shift while listening to the orchestra rehearse with renewed focus, come home, and practice for another 2 hours before bed. His fingers hurt constantly, but the pain was different from the ache in his chest that he'd carried for 12 years. This pain had a purpose. He didn't tell anyone what he was doing. Not his coworkers, not his neighbors, not his elderly mother who called him every Sunday evening. This was his secret project, his private rebellion against Hoffman's dismissive words. "You're just a custodial worker." Maybe he was, but maybe he could be more than that too. The orchestra was preparing for their biggest performance of the season, a gala event that would bring in wealthy donors, critics from major newspapers, and arts supporters from across the region. The program was ambitious, featuring several challenging pieces, including Paganini's Caprice No. 24, a violin solo so technically difficult that most professional violinists struggled with it. Patricia, the first chair violinist, had been practicing the Paganini piece for months. David had heard her working on it during lunch breaks, had listened to Hoffman's corrections during rehearsals. He knew every note, every difficult passage, every place where the piece could go wrong. He'd studied that piece years ago at the conservatory, though he'd never performed it publicly. One evening during his practice session at home, David decided to try it. Just for himself, just to see if he could. He pulled up the sheet music on his phone, set it on a music stand he'd bought at a secondhand store, and began to play. It was a disaster. His fingers couldn't move fast enough. The double stops were sloppy. The harmonics barely spoke. But he kept at it, playing the first page over and over, breaking it down into small sections, working each difficult passage until it started to smooth out. He was so focused on his practice that he didn't hear the news that would change everything. Down at the symphony hall, Patricia had collapsed during an evening rehearsal. The doctors said it was exhaustion and stress, nothing life-threatening, but she needed complete rest. She wouldn't be able to perform at the gala, and the gala was only 6 days away. David arrived for his afternoon shift on Monday to find the concert hall buzzing with tension. Musicians stood in small clusters talking in worried voices. Staff members hurried past with concerned expressions. Something was wrong, and the anxiety in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. He caught snippets of conversation as he collected trash from the lobby. Patricia was in the hospital. Nothing serious, but she needed rest. The gala was in less than a week. Hoffman was furious. They needed a replacement immediately. David's stomach tightened. He knew what this meant. The Paganini piece had no soloist now. That showcase moment in the program, the piece that donors and critics were specifically coming to hear, suddenly had no one to perform it. For an orchestra, this wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a potential disaster. He pushed his cart toward the main hall where he could hear raised voices. Through the open doors, he saw Hoffman on stage with the orchestra manager, a nervous-looking woman named Rebecca, who always tried to keep everyone calm. But there was no calming Hoffman today. "I don't care who you have to call," Hoffman was saying, his accent growing thicker with his frustration. "Find someone. Anyone who can learn this piece in 5 days. Maestro, we've already contacted every professional violinist within 200 miles, Rebecca said, clutching her tablet. The ones who know the piece are already booked. The ones who are available say 5 days isn't enough time to prepare properly. Then find someone who will say yes." Hoffman slammed his hand on the conductor's podium. "This gala represents 40% of our annual funding. If we have to cut the Paganini, if we disappoint these donors, this orchestra could be facing serious financial trouble." David quietly positioned himself near the back wall, pretending to dust the exit signs while listening. Other staff members and a few musicians were scattered around the hall, all watching the unfolding crisis. Over the next 2 days, David watched as Hoffman auditioned 5 different violinists. Each one was brought in, given a few hours with the sheet music, and then asked to perform for the conductor. David made sure he was in the hall for each audition, cleaning or organizing, always in the background but close enough to hear everything. The first violinist made it through the opening passages but struggled with the rapid-fire sequences in the middle section. Hoffman stopped her after 3 minutes. "Thank you, but no." The second violinist had the technique but lacked the passion. The notes were correct but lifeless. Hoffman listened for 5 minutes before waving his hand dismissively. "You play it like a technical exercise, not music. Next." The third and fourth weren't much better. One had the right feel but kept making small mistakes. The other had good tone but couldn't maintain the tempo in the difficult passages. By Wednesday evening, with the gala now just 3 days away, Hoffman was desperate. The fifth audition was happening late after the regular musicians had gone home. David was mopping the stage while a young violinist from a neighboring city worked through the piece. He was the best so far, coming closest to what Hoffman wanted, but when he reached the climactic section near the end, his fingers tangled and he had to stop. "Again," Hoffman commanded. The violinist tried again. Same result. His face was red with effort and embarrassment. Again! Another attempt. Another failure. The young man's confidence was crumbling with each mistake, and that was making everything worse. His hands started shaking. Hoffman stood up abruptly. "This is impossible. We're 3 days out and I don't have a soloist. This is absolutely impossible." The young violinist packed his instrument quickly, mumbling apologies, and practically ran from the stage. Rebecca tried to offer some encouraging words to Hoffman, but he cut her off. "Just go," he said, sinking into a chair. "Everyone go. Let me think." Rebecca gathered her things and left. The last few lingering staff members departed. The building grew quiet. David continued mopping, working his way across the stage slowly and methodically. He could feel Hoffman's frustration radiating from where the conductor sat, head in his hands. David knew he should leave. He should finish his cleaning quickly and get out before Hoffman noticed him. That would be the smart thing to do. The safe thing. But that whisper in his head, the one that had been growing louder since he'd started practicing again, was screaming now. This was his moment. The universe had somehow arranged for this exact situation, and he'd been preparing for it without even knowing. His hands tightened on the mop handle. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. What he was about to do was crazy. Hoffman would probably laugh at him again, humiliate him even worse than before. But if he didn't try, if he let this moment pass, he'd regret it for the rest of his life. David took a deep breath and walked toward the conductor. His legs felt unsteady, but he kept moving. When he was about 10 feet away, he cleared his throat. "Maestro Hoffman." The conductor looked up, seeming surprised that anyone was still in the building. When he saw it was David, his expression shifted to annoyance. "What do you want?" "I know the piece," David said, his voice quieter than he intended. "The Paganini. I could help." For a moment, Hoffman just stared at him. Then recognition dawned on his face. You're the janitor who was playing pretend conductor. The one with delusions." David felt his face flush, but he didn't back down. "I know it sounds strange, but I really do know the piece. I've been practicing it." "I could audition for you." Hoffman's laugh was sharp and bitter. "This gets better and better. First, I can't find a qualified professional violinist. Now the janitor thinks he can save the day." He stood up, walking closer to David. "Do you have any idea what you're suggesting?" "This is Paganini's Caprice No. 24. It's one of the most technically demanding pieces ever written for violin. Professional musicians spend years mastering it." "I understand that, sir. But I'm not just a janitor." The words came out stronger now. "I studied at the Riverside Conservatory. I had a full scholarship. I was good. Really good. Life happened and I had to leave, but I haven't forgotten how to play." "The conservatory," Hoffman repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. "And why exactly should I believe this story? Why would someone with conservatory training be pushing a mop around my concert hall?" "Because my father got cancer and someone had to pay the bills," David said, meeting the conductor's eyes. "Because sometimes life doesn't care about your talent or your dreams. Because I did what I had to do." Something flickered across Hoffman's face. It might have been surprise or maybe just curiosity. He crossed his arms. "Fine. You want to waste my time? Go ahead. There's a violin in the storage room. Get it and show me what you've got." David's heart leaped. "Really?" "Don't make me change my mind," Hoffman said. "You have 5 minutes to get the instrument and get back here. Then you'll play, And when you fail, you'll go back to your mops and never speak to me about music again. Deal? Deal, David said. He practically ran to the storage room, his mind racing. This was it. This was his chance. Everything he'd been working on for the past week, all those hours of practice with burning fingers and aching shoulders, had led to this moment. He found a violin in good condition, quickly tuned it, and hurried back to the stage. Hoffman was standing near the podium, arms still crossed, wearing an expression that made it clear he expected this to be a complete waste of time. David walked to center stage, the borrowed violin under his arm. His hands were sweating. His mouth was dry. But underneath the nervousness was something else, something solid and sure. He knew this piece. He'd lived with it for the past week, dreamed about it, worked through every difficult passage until his fingers knew the path by heart. He raised the violin to his chin, positioned the bow, and looked at Hoffman one last time. The conductor made an impatient gesture. Begin. David closed his eyes for just a second, took a breath, and played the first note. The first notes floated through the empty concert hall like birds taking flight. Clean, clear, and confident. David's bow moved across the strings with precision, and his fingers found their positions without hesitation. The opening phrase of Paganini's Caprice No. 24 filled the space, each note perfectly placed, perfectly timed. Hoffman's smirk began to fade. His arms slowly uncrossed. He took a step closer to the stage. David kept playing. The piece started deceptively simple before exploding into cascades of notes that required lightning-fast fingerwork and absolute control. This was where the first auditioned violinist had stumbled. David's fingers flew across the fingerboard, hitting every note with crystalline clarity. His bow arm moved with fluid grace, drawing out the rich tone of the instrument. The weeks of practice were paying off. Every late-night session, every sore finger, every moment of doubt had been worth it for this. David wasn't just playing the notes on the page. He was breathing life into them, finding the emotion underneath the technical fireworks. This piece wasn't just about showing off. It was about struggle and triumph, about pushing past limits, about proving something to yourself and the world. Hoffman walked closer to the stage, his mouth slightly open. His expression had shifted from skeptical amusement to something else entirely. Shock, disbelief, and slowly, unmistakably, respect. David moved into the middle section where rapid double stops challenged even experienced players. His fingers pressed two strings simultaneously while maintaining perfect intonation. The harmonics rang out like bells. The rapid-fire passages that had defeated the young violinist earlier in the evening flowed smoothly under David's practiced hands. He was in the zone now, that magical place where thought disappears and pure muscle memory takes over. The concert hall, Hoffman, his gray custodial uniform, all of it faded away. There was only the music and the instrument and the connection between them. The climactic section approached. This was the moment where most players either triumphed or collapsed. The notes came faster and faster, climbing higher up the fingerboard into the stratosphere of the instrument's range. David's bow became a blur. His left hand moved with impossible speed, yet every note spoke clearly. The music built and built, tension mounting, until finally, it resolved in a cascade of notes that ended with one long, sustained, perfect high note. The final note hung in the air for a moment, then faded into silence. David lowered the violin slowly. His heart was pounding and he was breathing hard. His fingers were trembling slightly from the exertion. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The silence stretched out, and David started to worry that maybe it hadn't been as good as he thought. Maybe he'd made mistakes he hadn't noticed. Then Hoffman started to clap. Slow at first, then faster. The sound echoed through the empty hall. Extraordinary, the conductor said, shaking his head in amazement. That was absolutely extraordinary. He climbed the steps to the stage, moving quickly now. Who are you? I mean, who are you really? David set the violin down carefully on a chair. I'm exactly who I said I am. I studied at Riverside Conservatory for 2 years before I had to leave. Music was my whole life before it became the life I used to have. And you've been cleaning this building for how long? 12 years. 12 years, Hoffman repeated, running his hand through his silver hair. You've been here for 12 years and nobody knew you could play like this? Nobody asked, David said simply. Hoffman was quiet for a moment, processing this information. When he spoke again, his voice had lost all traces of its earlier condescension. I owe you an apology. When I saw you conducting that night, I was cruel. I judged you based on your uniform instead of who you actually are. That was wrong of me. David nodded, accepting the apology but not quite knowing what to say. The gala is in 3 days, Hoffman continued. I need a soloist. You're better than anyone else I've auditioned. Will you do it? Will you perform the Paganini at the gala? The question hung in the air between them. This was what David had been hoping for, what that voice in his head had been pushing him toward. But now that the moment was actually here, fear crept in. Maestro, I've been practicing alone in my apartment for a week. I haven't performed in front of an audience in over a decade. The gala will have hundreds of people, critics, donors, important people. Yes, Hoffman agreed. It will be terrifying. Your hands will shake before you go on. You'll question everything. But I've been conducting for 35 years and I know real talent when I hear it. You have something special. Don't let it stay hidden anymore. David looked out at the empty seats, imagining them filled with well-dressed audience members. Could he really do this? Then he thought about the last 12 years. All that time spent invisible, pretending he was content just being near the music. All those nights conducting invisible orchestras, playing pretend while the real musicians got the applause. Hoffman's words from that awful night echoed back. You're just a custodial worker. Maybe he was. But he could be more than that too. I'll do it, David said. I'll play at the gala. The next 3 days were a whirlwind. Hoffman arranged for David to rehearse with the full orchestra. When the musicians found out that their new soloist was David, the janitor they'd walked past for years without really seeing, reactions were mixed. Some were skeptical. Others were curious. But when David played through the piece at the first rehearsal, every doubt evaporated. The musicians recognized excellence when they heard it, regardless of where it came from. Rebecca, the orchestra manager, helped David rent a proper tuxedo. She also worked with human resources to adjust his job title and salary. He'd still help with building maintenance, but he'd also be on the roster as an available musician. It was a strange hybrid position, but it worked. The night of the gala arrived faster than David expected. Backstage, dressed in his rented tuxedo, he paced back and forth while the orchestra performed the first pieces of the program. His hands were shaking exactly like Hoffman had predicted. His stomach was doing flips. He kept running through the difficult passages in his mind, worried he'd forget something crucial in front of all those people. Through the curtain, he could hear the audience. The concert hall was packed, every seat filled. He peeked out and saw the lobby had been full of people in expensive suits and elegant dresses, champagne glasses in hand, chatting about art and culture and the importance of supporting the orchestra. A stagehand touched his shoulder. You're up next. 2 minutes, David picked up his violin, not the borrowed one from the storage room, but his own instrument that he'd retrieved from his apartment. It wasn't the finest violin in the world, but it was his, and it had carried him through those crucial practice sessions. He heard Hoffman's voice addressing the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, for our next piece, we're honored to present a truly remarkable talent. Many of you have walked past this man for years without knowing his story. Tonight, David Chen performs Paganini's Caprice No. 24. David walked onto the stage. The lights were bright and hot. The audience was a sea of faces. For a split second, panic threatened to overwhelm him. Then he saw Hoffman at the conductor's podium, nodding encouragingly. He saw the musicians in their seats, instruments ready, showing their support with small smiles and nods. David raised his violin to his chin, positioned his bow, and waited for Hoffman's signal. The conductor's baton went up. A moment of absolute silence. Then down David played, and this time he wasn't invisible anymore.